Hello and welcome to episode 153 of The Dive Down, a Magic the Gathering podcast focused on the latest decks, trends, and strategies for the casual spike. My name is Stanislav here in Chicago, and with me on the line from Denver, Colorado, it's the Keeb master, Shane Beeps. Shane, what kind of Keeb you got there?
I'm just hold on, oh, there. Okay, am I unmuted now? Am I unmuted? Okay, hold on. I had to mute because I was click clacking while we were getting this episode going. I got to furiously type a top 8 from a recently announced tournament, or a recently announced top 8 from this weekend's tournament. So bear with me. How are you, Stanislav?
I'm doing just fine. This is giving me flashbacks of having to turn in assignments, proofreading essays the morning they're due.
Sorry, I'm looking up some Oracle text.
Is that like a 3D printed keyboard? Is that one of those custom clickety clackers?
No, it's just off the shelf. But anyway, it's good to see you all. Let's this is gonna be a good ep. This is gonna be a wild ep.
Definitely outside of our comfort zone. Also with us, the Godfather, the Comfy King himself, Dave Harbarger.
This is maybe the most confused I've ever been playing a deck. Gotta be honest.
Dave, I share your confusion looking at that V-neck. It's like down to your belly button, basically.
You know, that's what happens when you do house projects and have kids and forget to change your shirt for 2 days and your friend points it out on a podcast, which is an audio medium, and nobody cares about what shirt I'm wearing on an audio medium. There's only 3 people in the Twitch stream, Stanislav.
I care. It affects my mentality.
I'm sorry that it's a loose V. I've got that like bad... There's a whole TV ad about having the loose V, isn't there?
I think so. Where do you guys like to get your basic t-shirts? You know, not that screen printed stuff, but just a simple single color.
Banana Republic.
Target. I just buy a lot of clothes at Target because I'm a dad. That's what we do now.
You know, I go Gap.
Yeah.
You fall into the Gap?
I fall into the Gap. I used to do Target, but all their collars would be itchy and they would give me rashes on my shoulders and neck.
And they're loose if you wear them for 2 days, apparently. Your friend might point that out.
I like to just get my Magic product at Target because that's where I open my best packs, my best collector boosters.
I have so many sad stories of being like, yeah, I'll get a collector's booster at Target. Why not? And then I get in my car and open it up and I'm like, well, this was a waste.
They always are. At least they're pringly. On this week's episode, we are doing one of our patented deck dives with the Jolly Green Giant itself.
Yeah, this is the long-awaited second installment of a series we started many months ago about decks we hate that we're playing anyway, known as We Did It for Science. This is We Did It for Science, episode 2, the show within a show.
Is this really only the second time we've done this?
Only the second time we've done it.
Well, I'm glad we got the name of it before we had like an idea of how frequently we do it. That's the important thing, the show within the show.
Yeah, and as Stan said, in this episode, we are going to be talking about Primeval Titan. I can't even believe it.
And not just any Primeval Titan, Amulet Primeval Titan, the third.
Look, I only agreed to this because Stanislav was so convincing when he was like, we should do this. And I'm like, oh my God. I was just basically like, I know Stanislav will take the reins on this one. And all I have to do is ride in the sleigh and be delivered like a gift to this episode on Sunday night.
And really just complain a lot in our Discord.
I know.
No, it's not complaining, it's confusion.
Is it?
I had to make a choice today. It was, do I want to buy some fresh papaya at Whole Foods, or do I need to walk Shane through Keepable Hands in Amulet Titan?
Why not both?
I chose papaya.
You're good. You and I spent some time on playing each other on Moto on Friday night where we were trying to talk through Keepable Hands for me too, where I was like, what am I even doing? And guess what? We're going to teach you the meager learnings that we've had in the last week or so of playing Amulet Titan today on this edition.
That's right. It's the joys of playing lots of lands, analyzing the correct number of lands to put in a deck that's mostly lands, and really some of our absolute favorite mana-producing lands that this deck runs. Guys, I'm starting to think, is this a lands deck?
It's two things. It's a lands deck, and it's also a deck that you really just love to take screen grabs and show them to your friends what you did on turn 3. Because that was worth all of the losses for me was... You know, we're going to describe our favorite screen grabs later on. You're
good. Before all that, though, let's get through some housekeeping. Shout out to the newest members to join the Dive Down Nation, Sam G and Stephen P. Thank you both and welcome, new citizens. Also, big thanks and shout out to Pucky Fuss, maybe it's Pukey Fuss, for leaving us a new review on iTunes. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. And if you would like to support us directly, you can find us at patreon.com/thedivedown, where we have a number of different tiers for different levels of donations per episode. And love to give a little update. I think that Shane's giving me the signs right now to either Vogue potentially or to talk about deck boxes.
Talk about the rectangle.
Talk about the rectangle. Well, we did get an update from Legion Supplies about shipping for the deck boxes, and you may remember a month ago or so I said that I thought that these would be ready in the spring. That's probably when they're going to show up. Right now, the ETA of when we will have these is looking like April, according to Legion, and we will send them out as soon as we can after that. So never fear. People who are owed them, we will get them to you. We're keeping a list. We're checking it twice. Yeah, but it's looking like it's going to be, late spring before people really get these.
Yeah, the literal slow boats. So it's going to be shipped around the world once or twice. So bear with us, but it's out of our hands now.
I always thought that podcasting would kind of protect us, give us a little immunity from the supply chain, but no one can escape the supply chain.
You can't escape it. I mean, remember when we were trying to buy new audio interfaces a few months ago, Stan, and everything was sold out? Yeah. Also sponsored by Mana Traders. You know them. You probably love them. The best. ManaTraders.com. Use sign-up code TheDiveDown2021. I really hope we get a 2022, because otherwise it's going to be confusing if we get the dive down like 2024. So it's not going to work. So I just hope they work with us.
Or they fire. I hope they don't fire us too. That's another reason we'd like to get a 2022 coming up. But
yeah, sign up code TheDiveDown2021, 50% off your first 2 months. Thank you.
Yeah, and now before we get into things we hate, let's talk about things we love, which are modern Magic tournaments. We have 2 to talk about really, really quickly. The first one, Shane did a lot of this, so I'm gonna be the host. Shane's gonna be the talker. Stan's gonna pop in and give us his hot takes here and there. The first one we're gonna talk about really quickly is the Energy Series 5K Modern Trial Milwaukee, which is actually finishing up as we record this episode right now. And there's
the finals are on.
And the main reason we want to talk about this is why, Shane?
Well, one of the citizens of the Dive Down Nation, Jess, is in the top 8, was in the top 8, unfortunately. She was just eliminated from it just 15 minutes ago or so.
Daggers.
So sorry for the spoilers, but Jess was on her trusty Azorius control. I know that she has been maining that for quite some time, comes in with a lot of good insight in our modern channel on the Discord, a pillar of knowledge in the community.
Well, congrats to Jess for making the top 8, but let's talk about what actually was in the top 8. So as Shane mentioned, the finals are going on right now, and it is Sultai Infect versus Orzhov Infect, also known as Hammer.
Yes.
Honestly.
Gotta go fast.
So 2 decks trying to go fast with each other, probably minimal interaction, but I guess both of them have some. We'll see. That should be an interesting one. But here's what the top 8 was. Colin Bradley on 4-color Omnath, Bill Caminos on Rakdos Luris, Jacob Siegel on Sultai Infect, Cody Burton on Golgari Yawgmoth, Dominic Polarcio on Orzhov Hammer, Sky Bauerschmidt Sweeney on GDS, Will Kruger, of course, Will Kruger, Orzhov Hammer, Jess Robkin, as we said, on Azorius Control.
Did you know, I guess, in the abbreviated season of NRG last time, Will Kruger top 8'd 6 of the 10 events they held? Bonkers.
A true killer, Will Kruger.
How can you be that good at Magic?
Speaking of Will Kruger, well-known Titan player for a long time who is not currently playing the deck very much, but
yeah, I mean, he's on record just saying Hammer is the best deck in Modern.
Yeah.
I mean, we'll have more to talk about that in just a second, I think, because we do have Saturdays, December 11th, the Modern Showcase Challenge. And there might have been a few players on Hammer variants. Can you believe it?
How many?
Well, we'll get into that in a second, Dave.
Okay.
But first off, want to thank Bamzing and Aegis Aziz.
Yep.
Thank you.
Aegis
there we
Aziz.
go. That makes a lot more sense when you look at it as 2 different words. You make doing the work of talking about this stuff so much easier. They went through and got all the 6 and 3 or better decks from the tournament by literally just looking at replays and seeing what's going on while the tournament's going on. So thanks again, of course, Bamzing and Aegis Disease. If you forgot, these showcase challenges happen about 3 times a season, and seasons are basically about 4-month long time spans. And so you have to have QPs to enter these, 40 QPs, in fact. And the top 8 finishers get invited to the showcase qualifier, and they have good prizes. So why not?
Can I call my shot?
Do it.
Yeah.
I didn't get enough QPs to make it into this showcase challenge, but I'm going to see in the next one.
Oh, yeah, you got it. I mean, you have like 30 something, right?
Well, they're all about to reset. But yeah, I was like 10 shy. And now that I understand how to earn QPs and how prelims factor into that, yes, playing pretty well helps. But, there's other ways to earn them as well. I had never really set that goal for myself to actually earn QPs for any specific purpose. Now that I know what it all culminates into, I'm going to get there. I'll see you in 4 months, Moto.
I mean, honestly, Stanislav, we know that your goals have been to win and do well at real events. And I mean, honestly, I think the players that play on these events on Magic Online are probably better than a lot of players we're going to see at our local paper tournaments, just because it just funnels all those people right into MTGO. So that's a great place to test your mettle,
I guess. But Jess and Will Kruger play at a lot of the tournaments I go to. So
just run then. Yeah, Chicago is definitely a pretty okay placing. All right, so we had 371 players. And we have 66 of those decks that went 6 or 3 and better. And let's talk about the 6-3 or better meta. We have 9 hammer decks, or about 13.5%. We have 9 Azorius Control or Azorius Control variant style decks, another 13.5%. 12%, 8 decks, Isn't Murktide. 7.6% or 5 4-color blink decks. And so effectively, these are like the 4-color Omnath style control decks, but there's no actual counter spells in the main besides a few Force of Negations, but you add the Eternal Witness and Ephemerate quartets along with like the Singleton Time Warp, and so you're really trying to get a lot of blink value off of all your elementals and Eternal Witness and Icefang, Coatl, all kind of ways to get value off of your Ephemerates in this deck while still having sort of a controlling and inevitability long game.
Yeah, this is basically the other We Did It for Science deck from earlier, Omnath 4-color control stuff.
I forgot about that.
Yeah.
And then we also have 5 colors of Grixis Shadow, 7.5%, 6% Jund Saga, 4.5% Grixis Luris, also 4.5% Temur Footfalls, and then a bunch of 2-ofs or 3% of Golgari Yawgmoth, 4-color Omnath Control, Amulet Titan, Living End, and Izzet Control, and then a bunch of 1-ofs, about 15% 1-ofs. I think that's either 10 or 11 of those. Some stuff you might expect, like, the stuff you see, Scales, or Dimir Mill, or Eldrazi-tron, or Mono Green-tron, or Dredge, those kind of things that still just stick around and might do pretty decently in a tournament, but might not top 32. So, y'all, what do you think about this 6-3 or better meta? The pretty good decks.
It's pretty diverse, too. The top half of the decks, Hammer, Control, Murktide, Blink, and Shadow. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's better than just seeing like one deck eat up a quarter of the pie and then 2 other decks doing the rest of it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's a fair way to look at it. We've seen plenty of metas where it's like 20%-ish of a meta game is a singleton deck. So 13.5% is pretty okay, especially when the other one is so different than it. Going from Hammer to Azorius Control are pretty big swings.
Yeah. I mean, I think this just kind of feels like what Modern is right now. There's nothing that's too big of a surprise to me in this one. Maybe the fact that there's a lot of Murktide back is a little bit of a surprise, but I think that, it's all good.
Murktide. Yeah. I mean, the thing for me is like Hammer is still the top dog after months of being the top dog. Like it's saying something, I think, specifically about Hammer, that we've seen a lot of metagame shifts and cycles and sort of internal rotation of what's doing really well and what's fighting what's doing well. But Hammer has stayed up there as like just the best deck or one of the 2 best decks and most represented decks in tournaments like these over and over and over again. And that I don't think we can say about anything else in the metagame so far. I think it's also interesting that 25%-ish of the meta is feasibly control.
Mm-hmm.
We've got Azorius-based control, we've got 4-color Blink, we've got 4-color Omnath, we've got Izzet control, all showing up here. And I think just a few months ago, that would have been kind of like a pipe dream to say like, hey, like we're going to see 25% of a competitive modern meta be controlling decks.
Yeah, it's been bouncing around for sure. I mean, the thing that's interesting is I'm kind of trying to take a look through the deck list right now, and do the control list playing the Chalice game or not anymore? The blue-white decks, it looks like there's a couple, and the 10th place deck from MJ0202. So it looks like maybe people are still keeping up with that version, which I think can be pretty good. It's kind of like playing a Blood Moon deck, but a different axis in some ways.
And then also things of note that I saw was like Burn was kind of just like completely gone. Not even in our one-ofs was there a Burn deck.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's not even top 32. This is like, top 66? Just no Burn at all. And then there's only 2 Footfalls decks in the top 32 and only 1 Jund Saga deck in the top 32. So we saw a pretty big consolidation of kind of the good decks, I think, and also like a few of the smaller fish in this pond as well are showing up in the top 32. But I think just like a month or so ago, we would plan to see a lot of Footfalls and a lot of Saga in our top 32s, but not here.
So let's talk about the top 8.
Let's do it.
Let me, since I read off the other top 8, maybe I'll just read this one too.
Do it, Dave.
Zac Attack on 4-color Blink featuring Yorion. Deck that Shane was kind of doing some description of earlier. So I don't think we need to linger on that one. Pensur on Izzet Murktide in 2nd place. Looks like what you'd expect. I mean, nothing too spicy about this particular build of Murktide.
The most interesting thing to me was I don't think there was any main deck Force of Negations. And so I think that's something that, at least recently, I would expect to see maybe a little bit more in terms of like, hey, we're afraid of Belcher, which again, there was no Belcher in this entire top 66 at all. So as soon as Belcher rises up, either it's being hated out or it's just not there. And so the Pensur was just not afraid of it, I guess.
Yeah. Interesting. They do have 2 dress down on the sideboard, which is pretty interesting to see out of a blue-red deck as well. I hadn't noticed too much of that seeing play outside of Grix's Shadow, basically, but
That's been stock, to be honest.
Has it? Okay.
Yeah, for quite a while now. Just because Dress Down is a really great answer to Karnstrucks, the Elementals, it's very versatile across the board.
There you go. 3rd place, Gabesman on Yawgmoth. We got another Yawgmoth deck in the top 8 here. This deck sticking around. Comes and goes, but people love it. They keep coming back to it. This is another one of those builds that was the single Geralf's Messenger list that was originally kind of made popular by Demonic Tutors online probably, 6 weeks ago or so. But it's cool. Heavy on Grist. Big on Grist these days. 4th place, Rostov with Jund Saga. Nothing too surprising in this list. 5th place, DeKing 3603 on one of our first Hammer decks that is in here. Nothing too interesting about this particular version of Hammer, but the 6th place deck is Selesnya Hammer. So a new build that we haven't really seen too much. Most notably in here, 4 main deck Ancient Stirrings to help you draw into some colorless cards if you want.
Yeah, I'm curious why we haven't seen more of a splash like this, where it's like, hey, I need to like kind of really dig through my deck. I want to find certain tech pieces. You get access to things like Veil of Summer in the side, Gaia's Blessing in the side for the really bad mill matchup. Maybe it's been underexplored, or maybe this player has just got a little lucky.
I mean, I definitely think that there's something to be said for, there's always been a lot of talk about what's that last slot in Hammer going to be? Is it going to be Ingenious Smith? Is it going to be something else? The idea of just saying, I'm going to use a real cantrip instead of trying to play a creature that sort of does a medium version of a cantrip spell is pretty interesting. It does not, it can't get every single card that you want, but it can get a lot of important ones, including Urza Saga, a Hammer, or if for some reason you need some other artifact. But it does kind of get you what you want between those 2 things.
Also gets you lands. One of the things they cut were a couple lands.
Yeah.
So you can potentially just keep a single green source, and then Ancient Stirrings will frequently find that second land.
Yeah. But yeah, I haven't played a ton of Hammer, of course, but this seems like a good evolution of that build. 7th place, Howderho on Red White Prowess. Hey, it's the deck that I played last week at the Store Championships. The Doomwake list.
Yeah.
Only thing that's super different about this one is that I never found a way to include 2 Fury in the build that I was playing. Main, I had all my Furies in the sideboard, and this person has it split 2 main, 2 sideboard. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same deck that I was playing last week as well. You got your Blood Moons, you got your Chandra Dress to Kill, Dragon's Rage Channeler, Monastery Swift Spear, Ragavan, Soulscar Mage, Light Up the Stage, Dart Bolt, Prismatic Ending. Maybe this deck is going to hang around. I think that I've seen a number of people talking about it online, and so I'm glad to see it continuing to be reasonable.
So what have they cut to make room for those Furies? I think 1 Prismatic Ending, maybe?
1 land and 1 Prismatic Ending is what it looks like to me. I think the build that I was playing was 21 lands, and this one's only 20.
I see.
But yeah, that's my guess. And even the sideboard is pretty close to the sideboard that I had, although by having 2 Furies in the main, you have space for Seasoned Pyromancer. Also, they're playing Relic of Progenitus instead of Soul Guide Lanterns that I stole from Stan that in their sideboard, which is an interesting take too. Still has Blossoming Calm.
And the Shinka, Blood-Soaked Keep, it's just a mountain that sometimes makes your Ragavan hit a little better.
Yeah, all it does is it lets you attack into situations where you might have to trade, basically.
Hey, Obosh is legendary, okay?
Oh yeah, you can give Obosh first strike as well. But by the time you're playing Obosh, usually you don't care about stuff like that.
Look, Dave, you can give Obosh first strike as well.
Yeah, it's true. It is true. All right, yeah. Well, I like this deck. Maybe I'll keep playing it as well. 8th place, finally. Thurf on Gruul Scales. Gruul Scales. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago, right? Wasn't there a Gruul Scales deck that top 8'd something recently too?
I think so. I mean, it's just kind of effectively adding Goblin Bombardment in the main, like the Singleton Goblin Bombardment, which lets you, 1, have a sacrifice engine, or just a sacrifice enabler, something that lets you pop some creatures you don't mind dying to either make tokens go on to your Ozolith or like your Hangerback Walkers sort of become a bunch of Thopters and then pop all the Thopters with Bombardment to do a bunch of damage. So it allows like some unique styles of wins with that Singleton Bombardment that I think is pretty darn cool. And of course, you sometimes want red mana randomly for the Zabaz, destroy target artifact you control, activated ability, and then you get access to a few more red sideboard cards if you want. I think they are only using Ancient Grudge, which is perfectly smart and cromulent card.
What do we think of that top 8?
Sweet.
Yeah, a couple of cool decks. Others, some hammer and some other stuff, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we've got some cool decks and then some not cool decks. And I'll let you decide which ones I think are cool, which ones I think are not cool. But I do like seeing the Red-White Prowess deck. I do like seeing the Selesnya Hammer deck, of course. I do think there are some other cool decks to explore in this top 32 as well. Stan, unless you had thoughts on the top 8.
Well, yeah, I mean, just to answer Dave's questions, I
guess you should probably. I guess you give you an opening for that.
I think one of the interesting things about this top 8 is that we both see familiar favorites pretty much across the board. These are all decks that perhaps they've come and gone, like Hardened Scales. Sure, it won Vegas, but it's not like it's been a mainstay in the Magic Online competitive environment.
Right.
That said, I do feel like this is a very innovative top 8 across either individual decks like, Hardened Scales becoming Gruul or Hammer becoming Selesnya, or even just like individual pieces here and there. For instance, Outland Liberator, being a one-off in the Yawgmoth list. It's something that we played in Titan 2. I think that this is just a new card that people are starting to recognize as a potential modern tool. So I think we're just, because the format has been so familiar to us pretty much since MH2, we are actually starting to see people find little ways to level up the decks that are proven entities as well. Or maybe even in Prowess's case, utilize some even newer cards to keep attacking the meta.
Things are continuing to evolve a little bit. It's just not always, it doesn't always mean that there's a new deck, right? It does mean that things shift just from getting a new card here and there, which I think is good. Yeah.
I think we also had some cool decks to explore along with the 2 in our top 8. 18th place, there was TSP Gendrick on a low-to-the-ground Grixis control deck featuring Luris. I think we've seen things like this. It just always blows my mind that basically a 4 Ragavan, 4 Snapcaster, and a pile of spells is just kind of like a deck that can be played and do well. In Modern, a couple Clean to Dusk, some Consider, and Drown in the Lock, and K-Com, and Unholy Heat. All of the counter spells are in the sideboard. besides the Drawn on the Lock main. Drawn on the Lock, such a good card. Such a good card. It's just a beating.
I would say this deck is hard mode, kind of personally. Like it's threat light. It's a little bit light on control on the main, like you said, but it has lots of creature interaction. It's got some graveyard interaction and Cling to Dusk. TSP Gendrick is a control master.
Yeah.
Super well-known player. And so this is a deck that I feel like is probably not for the faint of heart, but still, it's a cool build. A lot of these Grixis Luris decks definitely do have at least one more threat than what we're looking at here. Generally, they have Dragon's Rage Channeler, for example, and this one does not, which is a huge surprise.
I feel like the players that can do the most winning with the least creatures are sometimes like they know how to maneuver themselves to where they have the final pieces standing and then win with those final pieces. And I think that's, like you said, that's Magic on hard mode these days. Is like, hey, I'm going to use every piece to its fullest potential, and then I'm going to end up with the final creatures on the board and just plink you to death with my 2/1s.
Mm-hmm.
We also had in 20th place was Lori Wa on Prison Tron, which is pretty wild. There's 4 Karn the Great Creator, 4 Thought Knot Seer, 4 Spellskite. Main deck. You are not equipping your hammer, my friend. Also 4 Chalice of the Void, 3 Ensnaring Bridge main, along with many of the other kind of usual Karn the Great Creator wishboard cards in the side to complete the prison element.
You know what else is really nice in this deck is the 4 Serum Powder.
Oh, yeah.
Which synergizes with Karn, because if you pitch hands to it for free mulligans, you can then get all these artifacts that you're probably pitching, because that's all this deck is, with Karn later on.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
Mystic Forge. 4 Mystic Forge in the main of this deck.
I mean, Mystic Forge is sweet when you're just kind of trying to plow through your deck and cast a bunch of stuff off the top of the deck. I mean,
pay 1 life to exile the top card of your library so that you can later go back and get it with Karn.
Beautiful.
As well.
Beautiful. So yeah, this is definitely the kind of deck that a certain player is drawn to, and more power to Loriwa for doing it.
Awesome. All right. Well, fun breakdown of a couple of events that are going on right now. Some interesting new decks that people are trying. Now it's time for us to eat our vegetables, though. Let's go to the segment where we're going to talk about everybody's favorite Jolly Green Giant,
Primeval Titan.
Stay with us. All right. Well, as we teased and talked about many times now, welcome to the second installment of We Did It for Science. And we did this for science. We did it for you. I was talking to someone in the chat the other day, in the Discord server the other day, and they said that our Discord was anti-Titan biased. And you know what? I couldn't disagree.
Why is that? Why do you think the 3 of us needed to do this for science rather than at any point kind of latching onto this deck for personal interest reasons? Is it the green cards?
Well, Dave does hate green.
Infamously, I didn't own any green cards that were modern playable for a very, very, very long time, for one thing.
I think in all seriousness, the reason that I don't gravitate towards this deck, and that I honestly, I'll just say this right now, I did not enjoy playing this deck, is that it's a different kind of problem to solve. And I think if you like putting these pieces together in the particular way that Titan asks you to do, it's a pretty cool puzzle. Like, in terms of your interaction between a lot of different pieces. Like, there is a lot of different ways to do a lot of different things with this deck, primarily land-based and land sequencing based, and the way they interact with different creatures that you have, or the Amulet of Vigor on the board. And you can really think 1 or 2 or 3 turns ahead. And you're doing that anytime you're playing a good game of Magic. But in this, you're thinking about how much mana can I make and when, and what pieces are going to allow me to do that. And for me personally, it's like not the puzzle I really like solving. But I think for a lot of people, doing that combined with the really cool payoffs and sort of toolbox aspect, then there's a lot there to enjoy.
This from the guy who owns Russian Tron.
Tron is baby Amulet.
Yes.
Tron is kind of baby Amulet.
Tron is baby
Say,
Amulet.
the other thing is, like, I just don't generally gravitate towards combo decks. And I think that from the very beginning of when I was into Modern, not Amulet, but Titan, and then later Amulet Titan, slightly later Amulet Titan was always kind of like a boogeyman deck that was kind of like this thing that I didn't totally understand what was going on, but it was always pretty good, and people were always talking about parts of it getting banned, and then stuff was banned, and so it just always kind of felt like not my thing. And so this whole time that we've been on the show, we've never had one of us break through to this huge like constellation of decks that is built around what's inarguably one of the most powerful cards that's available in Modern right now, especially with the enablers that Primetime has. So for us, when we think about how to approach a deck with the history, the pedigree, and all that fan base that we talked about of Titan as people from the outside, like how are we really thinking about this? A lot of times when we do these dive downs, we do a big history of the deck. Mm-hmm. We're not going to talk about that too much today because I think people mostly know where it's from. Also, if you want to hear a really good breakdown of the history of Primeval Titan decks, you should check out Dominaria's Judgments with Ari Lax and Dom Harvey. They recently did an episode that was a dive in how to play Amulet. We're obviously coming at it from a totally different angle from they are.
Yeah, we're coming at it from the bad player point of view.
Yes, exactly.
Or the newer player point of view to this deck.
Right. Those two people are actual Amulet masters, especially right. Dom Harvey. And I think our lens is what was learning this deck like, and what should people sort of anticipate and have to come to terms with if they want to pick it up for the first time. And then Dominaria's Judgment and a lot of Dom Harvey's articles on SCG can take you to that next level after you've maybe tried it out, kind of started to understand what you're doing with these cards and lands, and need to find additional resources to truly level up as a Titan pilot.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we were just talking about Primeval Titan has long been a staple of the Modern meta, basically since the inception. So much so, they knew that Titan was going to be powerful in Modern, that when Modern was created, I believe that Valakut was pre-banned in Modern if it was not in one of the very first bannings in Modern.
Pre-banned?
I sometimes forget which one it was, because they had some early bans that felt like pre-bans, but...
Not Cloud Post, though. You can have Cloud Post, but not Valakut.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, part of it is that Titan and Valakut had just been in Standard together during that time. And then later, after Valakut rotated out, Titan was still good later on as a deck that was kind of a foil to some of the Cawblade stuff that was going on at the same time. So don't forget that Valakut, Amulet of Vigor, and Primeval Titan were all in Standard during M11. Of course, Amulet didn't really figure into that at all because the bounce lands weren't in Standard at that time. And then it just kind of went on from there. Valakut was unbanned. Summer Bloom came into the deck, and then Summer Bloom was banned. Once Upon a Time was huge in the deck, and then it was banned. I mean, that's skipping a huge era between Summer Bloom and Once Upon a Time. It's probably 3 or 4 years of time in between those two things. Dryad of the Elysian Grove was printed. Urza's Saga was printed. Titan is always there, always doing new things, always trying new things.
I like that this very many one-sentence history lesson just completely ignores that Field of the Dead used to be a card.
Ugh, I don't even want to talk about Field of the Dead. In between Dryad and Urza's Saga, there was Field of the Dead. That's true, too.
You remember that one of the Denver events we went to, and we all played in the PTQ, and I was playing Dredge, I believe, and I went up against Titan playing with Field of the Dead, and I was like, well, I have no chance. I have no chance to defeat this monster of a deck. I'm so glad that card is gone.
Just Creeping Chill, bro. Creeping Chill, Conflagrate.
Flashback, Creeping Chill. There we go. We got there.
Did it. So, given the volumes of writing about it, the number of different lines, this week on the show, we're mostly going to be talking about two parts of Titan. What we thought about when we picked up the deck as a bunch of just first-timers, basically. Although Stan did do a dive down on Titan in like episode 16 of the dive down. So it's been 3 years or so since we really looked at Titan.
Episode 10.
10.
Episode
okay,
10
wow.
is Prime Real Estate. That was...
It's one of my best titles.
I intentionally did not listen to that episode. I was very nervous of what we said then. And I think one of the appeals of revisiting the deck now is we're all better players and better thinkers too.
It's also a different deck, right?
It's also a different deck.
In a different metagame. We have MH1 and MH2.
That's right. All right, so what's Primetime all about? Primeval Titan deck's all about? Primarily, and with some really extreme caveats, if you're first starting to think about how to pick up this deck wants to do two things. And in the sense that Tron likes to make Tron, and have a payoff. Titan wants to cast Titan, and play sweet lands.
Yeah.
And it wants to do it as fast as possible.
It's going to make you
and
jump
those sweet
through
lands make it happen.
different kind of hoops to cast Titan.
That's right. So why? What's so good about Primeval Titan? Like, how does that make it work? Other than the obvious, the fact that it brings so many extra resources to your board when you play it. There's kind of 3 different game plans in when I look at the Amulet Titan list that are going on right now. There's kind of 3 different primary game plans, right? And let me know if you guys disagree with this. Chat, let me know if you disagree with this. There's basically the old Amulet kill, which is I'm going to ramp into a Titan using bounce lands and Amulet, and I'm going to use Slayer Stronghold and get Boros Garrison, give my Titan haste, make it an 8/6, vigilance, haste, attack for that. If you have double attack for that 8, get 2 more lands. If you have double Amulet, then you can go and get Sun Home. You can give a double strike, and you can hit someone for 16.
Yeah, that's the busted one. You can get 20. You can get 20 off of that. I believe.
Yeah, if you can work it out sometimes so that you get 20 as well. Because if you do have double Amulet, then you can give it +2/+0 twice.
Yes,
and then do do Sun Home, give it double strike, and hit someone for 20 on turn 3. Basically,
You can win on turn 2 with this deck, but that's neither here nor there.
Would you consider this like the default? Like, I'm going to get a Titan. I'm going to get Boros Garrison and Slayer's Stronghold. I'm going to swing for 8 with Vigilance and Trample and just start clocking your life and getting lands into play. Maybe getting like Teleria West to then get another Summoner's Pact to then get like another Titan and sort of get the snowball rolling.
I agree with the premise that your main goal is to get Titan. I'm not sure if I necessarily agree with your suggestion, your question chain, that what we're trying to do is enable this Amulet kill with Sunhome and whatnot.
Sure. It's not like your default thinking is like, I'm going to put some pressure on them. It's kind of like, it's much more scenario dependent.
100%. Yes.
Weird.
Interesting. I mean, this is the sequence that I feel like I see the most as someone who receives Amulet, and over the years have seen the most out of Amulet across all the different eras, right?
Right. And maybe what I will give you, though, is that I think it's really important to understand this line as you're learning this deck, because this is one of the basic and maybe one of the simpler lines that if you understand how to organize your triggers and sequence your lands, this is how you can get someone dead out of nowhere, basically.
Right. So if someone is not very familiar with playing against this deck, they'll all of a sudden be like, oh my God, what do you mean I take 8? Or what do you mean I take 20? Like, it can happen, and that's how it goes.
It can happen to you.
But I do think it's one of the most simple ones. You're right. The next thing that I think that this deck has, and it didn't used to have in the same deck as Amulet really, is Valakut. And so when Dryad of the Elysian Grove was printed, that brought Prismatic Omen and an extra land drop on a single creature. Suddenly, the deck was really easily able to integrate a plan that includes Valakut as part of it as well. And Valakut does a lot of different things for this deck. Sometimes you're just hitting somebody with it and doing a bunch of kills early on with it, and maybe you hit someone only for 16 and you need the extra damage, and so you end up doing that on the next turn or something like that. The other thing that happens with Valakut sometimes is that you sweep someone's board if they have a lot of creatures, which came up a lot for me when I was playing. Definitely against decks like Elementals that tends to have like 4 or 5 different creatures on the board pretty quickly themselves. You know, if you get off to a kind of slow start, Valakut can help bring you back into the game by taking out their board as well. So while the Amulet version is kind of like the main engine and the main powerhouse of the deck, this Valakut plan that used to mostly be in escape shift versions of Titan is now available in this deck as well, thanks to Dryad, which is the second best creature in the deck, probably. I think we'd all agree.
Yeah, and what's wild about it is because of the tutoring aspect of the deck, like you can just throw a couple Valakut in there. Like, this isn't like a 4 Valakut deck. It's just like, hey, I can have a couple of them. And then maybe if I get a Vesuva, I can just copy another one of them. It's just like, it's such a flexible deck because of the land tutor aspect.
Yeah. I've seen Amulet lists that just run the single Valakut with Vesuva. And just to maybe highlight both of your points. With Dryad of the Elysian Grove, your Valakut is free. You don't have any actual mountains in this deck that would traditionally trigger Valakut. So if the Dryad isn't on the board, Valakut is, a non-basic mountain, essentially. But when Dryad's online, then it's doing a whole bunch of nonsense that Dave listed off.
Yeah. Absolutely. And then I think that the third thing that this deck or all of these decks are really trying to do is generic other ramp target kill dot deck, right? So every deck I think needs a backup plan, right? And this deck is constantly looking for what its secondary threat package is supposed to be, or maybe tertiary threat package, really, if you think about Amulet in prime time as the main one to do that big kill, Valakut to be the second one, which is sort of like the backup, and then there's a third one. There's a lot of really good other ramp targets around in Modern right now, and Primeval Titan decks are generally running something else like that. It changes over time, right? Like occasionally it becomes really popular to run Karn the Great Creator in this deck. That's a well-known additional package that gives the deck an extra dimension. Recently, Cultivator Colossus has been a card that's been making a lot of flashy waves and great screenshots, essentially, from this deck as well, because it's just kind of another thing that does the exact same thing that Primeval Titan does, which is take advantage of your deck having a ton of lands in it. But I don't know if there are any other kind of backup plans that you all are familiar with or remember from the past, but that's just the kind of third thing that I see in this deck.
Yeah, those are good ones.
Good list.
Yep. I mean, I will say the Cultivator Colossus, I played a one of in my Karn version. I hit 6 straight lands, because why not? Like, just the first time I cast
in a good way, right? Right. You hit 6 lands in a good way?
Yeah, in a good way. Yeah, it's just like beep, 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 beep. Perfect. Scoop.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. I mean, we can talk about it a little bit more later, but I had an absurd turn 3 because of Cultivator Colossus in one game where I ended up casting 3 Cultivator Colossuses, 2 Primeval Titans. I ended up with 15 Cultivator Colossuses because that's how many lands I ended up getting into play off of them, and then just Valakuted someone to death basically with all the triggers is where it ended up going.
Can you Slayer Stronghold a Cultivator Colossus sometimes?
I definitely have.
Yeah.
Especially when, I didn't draw into prime time, but I had good ramp. Like that's what the card is there for. And so you just kind of like back your way into it. You have to draw the Slayer's Stronghold, of course, like randomly have that, but it happened.
And it has trample because it's a big green beater.
That's right.
Yeah, it can happen to you.
So like we said, so these are the overall plans that the deck is trying to do. But the big thing that this deck is really trying to do is get as much mana going as fast as possible so that you can do these things as fast as possible. And that is where a lot of different things come in. The linchpin, of course, of this whole plan is the combination of Vigor plus bounce lands plus creatures that enable you to have additional land drops, such as Azusa and Dryad of the Elysian Grove. We can go deeper on that in a little bit, but that's kind of like the overall story of what Primeval Titan decks are trying to do in this configuration.
For sure.
I think this is a really good time to kind of give this deck some of the credit that it deserves. It is really hard to play.
I totally agree.
Yeah, the lines are just novel to the deck. Like the way that you have to think about the deck and the pieces that you're using, you don't use in other decks like this. So it's just like, this is something that requires you to pay attention to it and learn it. And you can't just be like, okay, I know a creature deck, or I know how aggro decks work, or I know how a mid-range deck works. I know how to Thoughtseize someone. This is just like, oh, I don't know how bounce land sequencing along with Amulet of Vigor works when combined with Dryad of the Elysian Grove, letting me play an extra land. It's just like everything is novel to this deck and honestly unique to this deck. And so that's why it's just, I think, so hard to pick up, is because it's just a new world to explore of Magic. And that's cool. That's cool to have that.
Yeah, I think it's daunting as well. And that may even be one of the reasons why we were a little gun shy about playing this deck in all these years. And I think not only is it daunting to pick up, but sometimes it's just hard to understand what's even happening across the table from you, because it can occasionally kill you out of nowhere with seemingly a single land drop that basically takes you by surprise, and suddenly your opponent can seem to do 20 different things. And it really forces you, or maybe teaches you, depending on your point of view, to think about Modern in this very unique aspect that we compared it to Tron, but it's almost to me like if Tron and Storm had a love child where you both need to set up a very specific resource engine that then allows you to kind of go off in a single turn to have what appears like a combo kill out of nowhere, but that combo kill can actually be fueled by creatures. It can be fueled by bolts in the form of Valakut triggers.
Yeah.
Et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think Amulet can get an edge from people who are not really like experienced modern players by being weird. Just like it's harder for newer players to pick up. I think it also can prey on newer players not really knowing what this deck is capable of. And even if you're like a moderately experienced player, a lot of times when I don't want to engage with the game heavily and someone's on Amulet, I was kind of like you're doing stuff. And I'm assuming what you're doing is legal, and I'm just going to see what happens because I don't want to think 2 or 3 turns ahead in this exact game. But that's the kind of thing you have to, and I think that's what is kind of harder about Modern sometimes. Is like this is just one of those decks that is weird and different, and you have to know how it works if you want to beat it.
Yeah, and I think the deck evolves in the middle of a game as you play it, where the first couple turns remind me of Tron, where you're trying to set up your resources in a certain way to basically get you to one of your multiple payoffs. But then you reach a certain point on turn 3 or 4 where I think it starts to operate almost like a control deck, where you have this toolbox of lands that you can occasionally fetch to solve very specific problems that are happening within the individual game. So this is the deck that will reward players for knowing when to prioritize a Cavern of Souls because you're in a control matchup perhaps, or a Radiant Fountain if you're in a burn or against a very aggressive deck that is pressuring your life total. Likewise, Castle Garenbrig, I think, was a big addition to this deck. I don't recall if we specifically mentioned it as a really powerful ramp tool that pairs well with all of your other ramp tools.
Stan, are you saying there's a powerful tool in Throne of Eldraine?
I think this is the one, yeah.
It's so weird. Man, Throne was such an underpowered set.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that there's a lot of redundancy among the lands because at least 8 of them are the bounce lands, but then there's all these one-ofs like Vesuva or Valakut, or, sometimes Teleria West is a one-of, Radiant Fountain, Crumbling Vestige, that do different little things, and sometimes you're taking lands out post-board and bringing in things like Bachuka Bogs or Cavern of Souls so that your lands are very much part of your interactive strategy in addition to your actual combo and win condition.
Yeah, that was one of the biggest things that you mentioned to me when I was first trying to figure out what to do with this deck. Is like when you're sideboarding, start taking your lands out. Like you can take lands out was like a huge light bulb to me because I was like, I don't know how to fit any of my sideboard cards in. Well, some of your lands aren't really good in certain situations. Like there's not really a reason to keep Cavern of Souls in against a deck that's not going to have any counter spells. And so when you have a deck that has 33 lands in it anyway, like the build I was playing did to start in pre-board, go ahead and take those out if you need Force of Vigor or whatever. Like do that instead. It's going to be fine.
Yeah, this really takes advantage of the lands having spell-like effects. Like you said, like that's what enables this to sort of be a toolbox deck. Not only with the lands, but if you play the Karn version as well, you have the toolbox aspect as well. So it's super flexible. And because of the many, many, many years of lands we have access to in Modern, like you're going to have access to any one you want. So you can make it work like you want and take it and metagame with your land selection.
Yeah. Speaking of lands, I think it's also really important to recognize that this is an aggro deck in the DNA. And there are sometimes these games where, turns 1, 2, and 3, it almost looks like the Titan player isn't doing anything because they're just putting down lands and generating a resource center, so to speak. But I think one of the things that separates the more skilled Titan players from beginners like us is knowing how those early lands you play and the mana that you set up for future turns is part of your big play that's going to happen on turn 3 or later that will sometimes win on the spot or basically put your opponents to check. That even if you're not swinging for lethal with Titan the turn you cast it, there are positions where because you played your lands really early on, you can get a Titan out really quick, and if your opponent doesn't answer on the spot, then he's just going to win on the crackback.
Yeah, and that's the thing that I would say. You should definitely keep in mind is yes, everybody thinks that you want to win with Amulet Titan on turn 2, right? Everybody wants a deck because it's sweet. It's a good story. It feels really powerful. It's very hard for your opponent to do something about that, of course. But there are lots of games that I played with this where like I would win a game on turn 8 or whatever. And some of that's because, or win a game by casting prime time into prime time without Amulet out, but just through like Castle Garenbrig and Arboreal Grazier getting me to enough lands out early enough where I was still a little bit ahead of curve, but not, you know, being totally abusive where I'm doing crazy stuff and bouncing and untapping and all that kind of stuff as well. You don't only have, I don't think that you only have to win with the unfair plan with this deck.
Right. And because it has so many of these pesky nuances, it's really easy for this deck to sort of blow up in your face if you're not thinking about all the effects that you have access to. And for me, at least, when I was first learning how to play it, I knew that one of the most frequent mistakes that I would make is I would just end a turn with 8 cards in my hand because I would run out of bounce land a little too soon. And if you're on the draw and sometimes you play a bounce land on turn 2, put a forest back in your hand that you started the game with, it's like, oh no, now I have to discard one of my lands, which maybe if you have a hand with 5 lands, you can get away with that. But other times it feels like
you made a
huge mistake because those lands are going to come in handy for whatever you're ramping into.
Yeah.
Bounce land manipulation, I think, is actually the hardest part of this deck. It's so hard to like know how to use them correctly, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that later.
Yeah, it's not just that, managing amulet triggers. I would argue this is a little harder online because you have to know what order to click things into, whereas in paper you can verbally shortcut things, and I think people, especially in Modern, have an understanding of what Amulet is doing, so you can just play your Karoo land and just say what you're doing, and then most of the time people will trust you. But even sequencing your creatures, especially your Dryads or some cases your Titans or Azuzas, if you do that incorrectly, you might not lose per se, but you will set yourself back and maybe slow yourself down by a turn or two because those creatures are really powerful, not only at fixing your mana, but in ramping you out, but actually enabling what some of these toolbox lands are capable of too. Yeah, and I think this is really where that Tron comparison comes in, right? And this is something that people say a lot of Amulet, and I think I heard you guys share this feeling where it's just solving a puzzle every game, where you have this opening hand, and it's like, can I keep a 6 lander if some of these lands are Urza Saga and bounce lands? And trying to understand what the puzzle pieces in your first few turns, what sort of picture they're going to create over the course of the game. Whereas the difference between this and Tron is, once you make Tron, that deck plays itself.
Sure.
It's like, okay, great. Karn liberated on turn 3, go. With Amulet Titan, because it has the combo and the control and the aggro aspects, you have so many more decision trees. And you really have to understand the format and sort of understand the position that is either going to keep you alive longer or help you stabilize, or maybe kill your opponent as quickly as possible. And knowing when to navigate those 3 directions is the thing that makes this deck both really powerful, but also so complicated.
Yeah, it just makes you work for it because you have colored mana. So it's like, hey, you can do more, and you have access to like this land toolbox, but because you're not just using the Urza lands, you've got to piece this stuff together in a different way. And so for you to have access to Primeval Titan and so many lands of different colors, like, you can't just play the Urza lands. So make you jump through a few more hoops.
Yeah. I mean, I think the big thing about this deck right now too, that we should go back to, it's like, it's always been pretty consistent, especially from the people who really know how to play it, right? But right now it feels like, I don't know how you could make this deck any more consistent than it is right now, unless they literally printed a card that was like Prime Time, like a smaller version of Prime Time. Like if Elvish Reclaimer was 25% even better than it was, and it was a shoe-in for that secondary threat slot. But the deck it's like the most rule of 8 deck that there is. You have 8 amulets basically because of Saga and Amulet itself. And Saga is like an uncounterable amulet. So being able to play that and then delay a little bit, get that to come out through counter magic, and then maybe get to do your stuff is wild. You can have up to 8 rampy creatures if you want. I mean, I don't count Arboreal Grazier in that. I'm kind of talking about Azusa and Dryad in that the decks don't typically run a full pack of those generally. Then you have Primeval Titan plus like Cultivator Colossus or Karn is like your backup payoff. So you have 8 of your payoffs as well. Plus you have Summoner's Pact to be able to like glue everything together depending on when you can do it. And then you have all the lands themselves, and the bounce lands are hugely important to be able to be redundant. And so the deck is really, really tight right now as far as the actual construction itself goes.
Yeah, the flex spots that we tend to see are whether or not you want to play an expedition map, how many copies of Explore you want to run.
Or Grazier. Like I've noticed some decks that don't have a full pack of those or that have Explore instead of Grazier or things like that. Yeah. But I think that the weird thing about this is because the parts are so redundant, you do keep mull decisions are pretty tough with this deck, I think, especially when you're starting out. Yeah. And so can we talk a little bit about some keeper mull, or should we save that until later?
We can try. Let's do it.
Okay.
Sure.
Because this deck has a range of keepable hands.
Right.
It's not like Tron in that you want to look at how do you get to 7 mana on turn 3. I think the range can fit, post board, what am I doing to deal with whatever my opponents are doing? Like, do I have a path to a toolbox land? Or sometimes in game one, it's how do I make mana as quickly as possible and then try to find the payoff? Or how do I get to a Teleria West or a Summoner's Pact as quickly as possible, etc.
So my big question here is totally understand what you mean, Stan, about like trying to be adaptive and having a game plan. But if we think about the best hands versus like the tier 2 hands and things like that, the one thing we talked about with Hammer, for example, a couple of times is that it's actually pretty easy to find a hammer in Hammer time, right? Like you pretty much can get that equipment whenever you want. The sort of sticking point with Hammer is the cheat effects are harder to get. They're not as tutorable. But the thing that lets you cheat it on is really the limiting factor to the deck. What do we think that is in this deck? I had a lot of times where I was like, well, I have a hand that can make a ton of mana early on, but I don't have a payoff. I don't have Primeval Titan or Cultivator Colossus, And we talked about this with Tron too, where it's kind of like you just want to keep a hand that makes Tron and then hope that you draw into a payoff, right? Like that's the thing. You don't mull a hand that is going to get Tron because you don't have Karn Liberated, for example. You don't have something to do with 7 mana. What do you think here? Like, do we keep a hand that just makes a bunch of mana and trust that we're going to draw one of our payoffs? Do we try to make a game like that into Dryad? Like, what's the axis that we're working on here? Is Amulet just better than everything else, and hands that have Amulet we should just pretty much keep almost regardless of what's going on with them, or what? How do you think about that after playing it for a minute?
I think that you don't have to prioritize threats in your opening hand. I think you have to prioritize the engine. If you have a threat and lands, cool. But to evoke your Hammer comparison, I actually think this does have some redundancy with threats, because in addition to the actual Titans or the Colossus, the creatures in particular, you have 4 Summoner's Pact. And you even have some redundancy for Summoner's Pact with Teleria West.
Right.
So even if you don't find a big trampler, sometimes you'll just find Azusa. And then Azusa opens your deck up a little bit more too into what you need to draw into. It expands the best top decks. It doesn't limit them per se. So that's why, in my mind, anything with lands and an amulet is usually good to go. And then you can sort of trust your deck to eventually find you, a way to win. That was at least, what my gut told me after playing with it a little bit.
Yeah. And then there's some other like more obvious kind of ships that you have to do that come up occasionally with this deck that you should keep in mind. Like there are some hands that it's almost like no matter how good your hand is, you can't keep a hand that has only bounce lands.
Yes.
Right? Because you literally can't do anything.
You just can't play you can't play lands, literally.
You can't play a land. So bounce hands early on, they're not really lands. Like you kind of need a couple of lands that you can play and a bounce land to be able to be in the best position. Even having one land that you can play and a couple of bounce lands can be dicey depending on how it's enabled by the rest of your hand. I think.
Did you guys ever find yourself in a position where you had a turn 1 Urza Saga and then bounce lands from there, and you had to decide whether or not you're willing to delay how quickly you get the Amulet of Vigor, because you can ramp faster, or you can, kind of hold back your lands and try to get an amulet down?
Yeah, constantly. I feel like that was a major point of tension. Like I want to talk a little bit more about the bounce land conundrum, and I feel like whenever I play against someone who knows what they're doing with Valakut, I just feel like the bounce lands are not a hindrance to them at all. Like they're just, and I think it really comes into play when you have a Dryad or particularly an Azusa, where it feels like it's not a hindrance because you're making so much mana with the multiple ETBs and like the multiple times that you can tap them for 2 mana, they come back to your hand, that you play them again, you get 2 more mana out of them. So it's like, okay, you're not actually causing any issues here. But I felt like anytime I didn't have the ability with an amulet in play to play multiple lands a turn, it's like, why do I have these silly bounce lands? Like they felt so bad, and I felt like maybe I was just doing something wrong, where it's like I don't know how to properly use these tools because I'm just sort of like bouncing crap back to my hand and like sort of having really slow mana development.
Yeah, it's funny. That's kind of how I felt at first, and maybe I'm too optimistic on them now, but I do think that they are still soul lands, right? And if you can go turn 1 for, in a less ideal keep where you're like, okay, I don't have amulet, maybe I go like turn 1 forest into Arboreal Grazier into play a bounce land and return the forest to your hand. That's still a powerful opening, even if you don't necessarily have a line into amulet, you know what I mean, right away, because you're going to be able to make a bunch of mana. You get to have 3 mana on turn 2, which is similar to what would happen with Grazier, land plus a land drop as well. But, being able to ramp like that is still really good. And those cards can help you do that in a way that doesn't slow down your mana development. The thing that's tough with them is just if you draw too many of them, right? Because really having a couple around is okay.
Too many too soon.
Too many too soon. Yeah.
Because you get to a point where you just want as many bounce lands as possible.
Yeah. Especially if you have Valakut out and you're like, okay, I'm just going to play a bunch of drops and just make a bunch of triggers. Yeah. So, I mean, it does help you get to the natural non-amulet Castle Garenbrig into Primeval Titan before curve kind of hands, which I think is actually not an underrated, but it's like the fair version, backup plan version of this if you have a bad keep, essentially.
Yeah. I also think that with the exception of an actual no-lander, no one's keeping no-landers except, Belcher. You can keep hands where you need to top deck a land too. When you're playing more than 30 lands, you can sometimes keep a sketchy 2-lander because chances are you're going to start drawing lands off the top within a turn or 2. And I think that's also really important where maybe you have a hand that's like Summoner's Pact, Titan, Amulet, and, 1 or 2 lands on top of that. You're probably going to just draw lands, for a while after that.
Yeah. Still can't keep one that's bounce land.
Right.
That stuff, right? You have to have one land that, even if it's Garenbrig and you're like, okay, I have to take off turn 1, but I don't want to mull the 5 or something like that. I think you can kind of do that kind of stuff and just be behind a turn. But,
well, that's because an opening hand that's all bounce lands is functionally a no-lander.
Right, exactly. Yeah,
which is true. What we cannot keep, right? Because you want to be able to ideally play a land every turn, because when you're doing that, you are eventually getting to the point where you're either playing multiple lands every turn or getting to the point where you're playing, lands that produce 2 or more mana every turn.
Yep.
I say 2 or more because if you have a double amulet out, your bounce lands are producing 4 mana, and that is pretty nice.
Yeah, pretty nice. But wow, is it frustrating when you have that going and you're like, okay, I have nothing to do with this. Nothing I can do with this mana right now, where I'm trusting the deck, but you still kind of fizzle because you have all the mana in the world, but no cards.
I feel like my early game is so heavily dependent on the mana ramp creatures, like the ones that let you play additional lands, or like a Boreal Grazer that spits a land out onto the battlefield. And I really want to pick your brain about something, okay? And what the heck is up with not 4 Azuzas? Like, I feel like when I was, like, a few years ago, Azusa would bust this deck wide open. It's like, if they have an Azusa and you do not answer it, then they're playing 3 lands a turn when combined with an Amulet, or even sometimes without combined with an Amulet. They're just ramping their mana and making so much mana when they have the bounce land scenario with the Amulet in play that it just makes stuff go ham. But now Azusa is being shaved or being eliminated entirely at times, and I'm just like, how is this deck functioning without the ability to make as much mana as I want with these bounce lands?
Yeah, I didn't see too many where there were no Azuzas, but I definitely see lists where there's 2.
Or 1.
For sure. I haven't seen too many. Is there some with 1 too?
Yeah, she's very marginal now.
Yeah. I played a 1 Azusa deck. The one I'm looking at, the first place of the Modern Challenge of November 27th was a 1 Azusa deck.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a couple things going on here. One of them is Azusa is really easy to kill because it's a 1/2. So that's putting a lot of high reward, high risk. Like this might have changed dynamics a little bit with Fury being around so much and things like that. But in a world of lightning bolts, Dryad is a better option. You know what I mean?
Even in a world of unholy heats. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. Especially because it's hard, it's hard to get Unholy Heat online before you can do what you're doing with this deck. It's still a very good card against this deck. Don't get me wrong. The other thing is that Dryad, because it has 4 toughness, is really good at slowing down aggro decks that are trying to attack into you. And so if you have a deck with, you're not going to find a lot of people who back in the day would have like prowess, that you would have the guts to block a prowess creature attacking into you with your Dryad. But it is a deterrent for people who don't want to try to see if you're a calling station, basically, and swing in with their tiny creatures and be like, hey, is my Monastery Swiftscur going to survive? Or you have to throw a lightning bolt at the Dryad and also have the little creature hit it post block to be able to like have it actually kill the Dryad. So it slows people down. It's similar to Arboreal Grazier in that way, where Arboreal Grazier is fine as a ramp spell, and some people still play Sakura stuff over it. Sakura Scout, right? Is that the card?
Yeah, that's the one.
Tribe Scout.
And things like that. Yeah, Tribe Scout. That's the other thing. But Arboreal Grazier is a good blocker.
Really good blocker.
It blocks Ragavan all day. It blocks Goblin Guide all day. And so
it even has reach, right? Like it'll buy you a turn against DRC. And if anyone's spending a card to remove it, you are winning in that exchange.
Yes. Hands like so far ahead in that. So I think what's happened is Azusa becomes marginal to the deck because it doesn't provide as much defensive value as Grazier and Dryad do. And so just as a way to shore yourself up against decks that are sometimes faster than you have these cards that are just good now.
Yeah. I think it's also worth noting that Azusa was really good when the central core of your deck was turboing out Titan, but because Dryad does a reasonable Azusa impression, the key difference that we need to acknowledge is Azusa lets you play 2 extra lands per turn. You can make 3 land drops with Azusa. Dryad, you can only make 2. Azusa is really great at turboing out Titan, but the thing that we keep kind of mentioning is that Titan isn't always, not only is it not your only win con, it's not necessarily your best win con in certain games, whereas Dryad opens up more of those opportunities, whereas Azusa is a bit more linear. It forces the deck to be more linear when its growing power level is and how multifaceted it gets to be and perhaps less linear it is over time.
And I guess I do feel like too, like Dryad giving you 2 land drops is sometimes like all you need. Like 3 can be overkill, where it's like if you have 2, like if you have an extra land drop and the whole amulet thing going on, then you do generate a lot of mana pretty early on, and you're getting like those turn 3 or turn 4 Titans that are plenty good.
Yeah, and of course, Dryad turns on.
Yes, Valakut. Yes,
Valakut. And so you're always going to play Dryad first, and then some number of Azusa from there. But I do think that a lot of what we talked about is why you're not all in on Azusa anymore.
Yeah, I think there are situations where Azusa's worse than Explore, where she is a really good ramp tool, especially in those early first couple turns. But Explore gives you velocity, and when we're talking about keeping hands that are predominantly resource-based and then trying to find your win condition, Azusa doesn't necessarily enable that unless you have Teleria West, whereas Explore will sometimes draw you into the thing that you need to actually close out the game. Great question.
Yep.
I hope we got it right.
I mean, I don't know. Like for me, it just we're talking a lot about kind of the opening game of Amulet, and I just feel like the pieces had to come together for me in like very obvious ways, or else I was feeling pretty futile. And I just so very often wanted like I have an amulet, I have a multi-land drop creature, and I have a bounce land. And it's just like, hey, I can make a lot of mana here, and that's good. Or like I have the land, the colorless land that comes into play tapped and like makes another piece of mana for you, and then when you untap it with Amulet, you're effectively getting a soul land there, and like that's very obvious, right? And I'm curious what your all experience was in terms of these are the pieces I'm looking to come together, and if you didn't have like the obvious stuff, how often did things just sort of fall into place for you? Like, what were you looking to do? Does that make sense? Like, if I didn't have a Dryad, or I didn't have, or I didn't even have an Amulet, like you're just like, I'm gonna hit land drops and see what happens.
I mean, kind of, but I think that you have to keep openers where you sort of know what you're going to do for the first few turns. You know what I mean? Where your first few turns are a step beyond just, I will produce, 4 mana on turn 3, 6 mana on turn 4. I think your opener should be like, I'm going to produce these types of resources, and I need to draw X, Y, or Z to actually have a plan beyond that. And I think that's kind of okay with this deck, whereas you know what you need to draw into, especially if that thing is a land, because you have ways to sometimes draw into them, and you have redundancy to find certain things. And whether it's one of your 12 threats, if you even have that many, being able to actually have a plan early on, I think is one of the things that helps inform those keepable hands, and also is the level up moments where you kind of realize like, oh, this is a hand that looks really slow at first, but if I drop, any one of these 5 lands, then I can just go off. That's a vague answer.
It's hard
to a very specific question, because the texture of your hands is so vast.
I don't think I got there. Honestly, like I just don't. I'm still in the stage where I'm kind of like groping around a little bit. When I get a hand, I'm like, am I gonna? And then sometimes it happens, and I'm like, I don't even know how I did it, but I want on turn 3. Like I don't know how I didn't see it coming, but here's what happened. I mean, the most interesting hands to me, not most interesting, but the ones that are like the most super powerful when you're like turn 1 Urza's Saga Amulet go,
yeah,
and then you're just like.
Yeah.
Like what, like, even if they blow up, I played against people who had Wear Tear, and they're like, well, I'm going to use my Wear Tear to get rid of your Urza's Saga right away, even though you already have Amulet, because I can't wait until I have 3 mana to be able to get both of them. So that was always something that was kind of like, yeah, that's an easy one. But when your opening draw is like Arboreal Grazier, Azusa, land, prime time, and you're kind of like, okay, like I think I'm gonna get there, but I might die before I get there, and I don't have Amulet, but I have a lot of drops, and so like maybe it's gonna be okay. Like
that's a snap
actually
keep,
sounds
Dave.
like a decent hand.
Dave, that sounds like a great hand, because you're just gonna draw lands. You're gonna get Titan on turn 3.
I'm trying to imagine a bad keep, what's like a borderline keep, and I did not describe a good borderline keep. It's true, or where you're like Azusa, Dryad, and 4 lands, and you're kind of like, well. I guess I do this because I'm going to have a ton of mana, but like, let's see where this goes, Yeah. But that's the thing that Urza's Saga has really changed about this deck so much, is that, because it's a land, you can draw Expedition Map, you can get to it in different ways to make sure that you get that Amulet out and start going for it. You know what I think the hardest card actually to play in this deck is? In a weird way, I kind of think Summoner's Pact is the hardest card to play in this deck.
This is what I was going to ask y'all, is like, I've sort of come to equate Summoner's Pact with just a redundant Titan, but we know it's not just a redundant Titan. So how were you all using it to success in getting other cards? Like, when were you like, I need to get a Dryad here, or I want to get an Azusa here because it's worth it to me, and I'm going to I'm going to also be able to pay for the pact after the fact. Like, when were you looking for that kind of stuff?
I think in hands where you need to improve your ramp plan and you don't have a good creature to enable the ramping, that's where pacting for Azusa or Dryad is really relevant. Whereas pacting for Titan is when you have everything else lined up to just win in a turn or two.
Yeah, I do think it's tricky though, because if you, in those situations where I was thinking about using Summoner's Pact to draw Azusa or Dryad,
Right.
I'm thinking about it, it's often because I'm mana constrained. And so then what you're doing is, best case is Summoner's Pact turn 3, you get an extra, cast Dryad, get an extra land drop, have 5 mana, or have 4 mana going into the next turn. And then you use your whole turn 4 to pay for the pack trigger and then drop an extra 2 lands. And then you're going into turn 5.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that felt like not good to me. And then also casting Summoner's Pact at that point in the game, I died a couple of times because people did tricky stuff to me in situations like that, where like someone randomly drops a Field of Ruin and I'm like, wait, who? Like what?
Oh,
and then you're just dead. And
you never just died because you miscounted like me?
I mean, I definitely came close a couple times where I was like, I can cast Pact, but oh wait, I only have a Simic, Growth Chamber is the only green mana source I have, and I don't have another one that's going to be in play if I do this.
Yep, I have done that. I've misbounced for sure.
Yeah, I definitely had somebody, I had somebody with a Cryptic Command return one of my lands to my hand on their turn, which was just like, cool, I'm dead now. Thanks. Yeah. Bye. So it's tough, like I worry, I'm pretty gun shy about Summoner's Pact casting it in those situations unless I'm looking for Primeval Titan or Cultivator Colossus in the deck that I was playing.
Well, I think you have to be a little braver. I did have those situations too where I pacted aggressively for a Dryad and then they just killed the Dryad and all of a sudden I no longer have the mana to pay for the pack trigger. But maybe that's my own fault for maybe kind of showing my hand so aggressively. What I think this question is really good for is kind of serving as a reminder that Summoner's Pact, isn't just your win condition, it is also a ramp spell. And you can occasionally find yourself in those situations where the thing that you need for your deck to open up is finding a Dryad, and because you have a Pact of Negation, you'll get there, even if you're not necessarily pacting for the Titan kill.
Yeah, I think another thing that happened a lot late game was I have had a good run with Titan, but they killed it. And maybe my second time I got an attack in, but they blocked or something. So they're not like super close to dying. They're less than 10 life. But I have a Valakut, but I don't have whatever. I don't have Dryad. You go get Dryad to turn Valakut online and then drop it. Like that seems like a no-brainer, I know, but that's a situation that did come up sometimes where later in the game I'd be like, well, I just want to kill them with land drops, and so I'm going to get Dryad to do that, and we're going to go from there.
I think Pact for Azusa is really good when you're holding a bunch of lands and then you want to try to either top deck a way to get to Titan or something else, whereas Pact for Dryad is really good if maybe you only have 1 or 2 more lands in your hand, and then you use your Dryad as a way to fix your mana, pay for the pack trigger, and then do whatever else is on top of your deck. Sometimes you can just pact for Cultivator Colossus. You can ignore the Primeval Titan altogether because you have, Dryad out, you have Valakut out, you don't have enough lands to turn your Valakut into a lightning bolt machine, but Cultivator Colossus, because it draws you a card for every land you play, and your deck is at least half lands, you'll just end up in a position, and this is what the screenshots we're talking about are, whereas you cheat in a Cultivator Colossus as quickly as possible, and then you win on the spot without ever attacking, because very, very quickly and suddenly you've turned your Valakut online.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the alternate threats for a minute. Cultivator Colossus, I'm going to read it since it's a new card, in case people don't know. It's 4 generic green for a star trample. Cultivator Colossus's power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control. And then it says, when Cultivator Colossus enters the battlefield, you may put a land from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. If you do, draw a card and repeat this process. So this card is really cool, I think. I'm not sure how long it's going to stick around in this deck, but I had a lot of fun playing it because of what Stan said, which is basically like, you actually, if you have a hand that looks like it doesn't do much, which happens sometimes in this deck where you have 5 lands in play and your hand is 5 lands, you can reload basically by using Cultivator Colossus to play those lands all at once and draw cards to replace those lands, including if you draw other cards that replace those lands, you get to put those lands into play and then redraw for them again. So basically you kind of get to draw until you don't have any more until you don't have any more lands in your hand, which is awesome because it means you can go through a ton of your deck. When I was talking about turn 3 playing 3 Cultivator Colossuses, I'd gone through more than 30 cards in my deck on turn 3. One thing I'd be really clear, because when this card was spoiled, a lot of people thought that you could just use a bounce land to go infinite.
Mm-hmm.
That is not how the timing on Cultivator Colossus works. You only get to play the lands out of your hand, replace those, and play more lands out of your hand. There's no triggers get to resolve in the middle of this or anything like that. So it's just kind of like one chain that happens from Cultivator Colossus, and you just kind of...
Yeah, all the triggers sort of pile up.
Yeah.
I even found myself in some situations where it didn't necessarily matter how I ordered the triggers and like how I sequenced my Amulet triggers versus my Valakut triggers, because the Colossus is just going off in such a way that it's pure inevitability on that turn.
Yeah. So I think it's a good threat. It's a similar but different access to Primeval Titan. It's one of the only things that lets you draw a lot of cards in this deck that can help you have some backup plans for when the Colossus is inevitably killed, most likely. But these kind of secondary threats, they come in and out of the Titan decks, and so who knows how long this particular one will stay around if it does for real. It dies hard to dress down, of course.
Yeah, I think the thing that makes Colossus interesting versus Karn, which is the next card we're going to talk about, is that Colossus gives you another way to be very explosive. Where Primeval Titan can be a super explosive thing, Colossus can be a very explosive thing. Whereas Karn is much more methodical. There's no Karn play that is explosive, but I think we're also contractually obligated to talk about Karn because he sort of keeps coming and going from this deck, and the jury's still out on whether or not those, 4-ish slots should be devoted to Karn or a mixture of Colossus and other cards.
So Shane, you played with Karn a little bit this time.
I did. He wasn't overly game breaking for me. I think what Karn does is, one, it gives you something to do cheaply that still has an impact on the game, and because all we're saying is your Dryad and your Grazers, they block well. That's really what you need in a Karn deck, is you cannot have small creatures picking off Karn, especially even flyers like Dryad has reach, which is dope. And so it blocks small flyers as well, though we're not in a heavy small flyer metagames like we're playing Spirits or something like that.
Arboreal has reach, not Dryad, by the way, but yes.
Did I say
You
Dryad?
did.
I apologize, Arboreal Grazer, you amazing little one-drop, you. But yeah, so I think Karn is really good in particular metagames because, one, it has the anti-artifact desynergy, where it just turns off your opponent's activated abilities of various artifacts, which is really good. And then if you have any time at all, you can start attacking their mana base, or you can get down the ever useful things like Ensnaring Bridge or Pithy Needle and all that kind of good stuff that Karn enables. I think one of the reasons that Karn is not very popular right now is, one, regular old Greentron is not particularly well positioned. It hasn't got an upgrade for a few years. And two, Tron also doesn't have any way to protect against the very wide variety of small creature decks that we see in the metagame right now. So Amulet Titan does both things. One, it gives you mana to work with and fast mana to work with, and then also gives you blockers to protect Karn and get some stuff going for disruption. So I think that's really valuable and a really nice aspect of Karn in this deck. I mean, of course, I cannot speak to whether I think it's better or not, but I do think that it's a good tool and it's a good deck to use that tool.
There's a huge thing here with Karn too, which is that it really depends a lot on how good the static is, right, at different points in the metagame as well. And so in a world with a lot of hammer, it's kind of medium, right? Where like Karn is good sometimes because it makes you not able to equip hammer, but it doesn't stop people from Sigardizating hammer into play. So you kind of get this weird middle road, right? Where it seems like it would be better against that deck, I think, than it is personally.
I mean,
is that right?
Stoney's good. Stoney's perfectly good against hammer, I think, for sure. Especially if you have a game plan, and Titan usually does.
Right. Yeah.
I also like Karn in the face of disruption. So where the Titan Dryad plan is actually very disruptible with just a Blood Moon sometimes, or a Force of Vigor sometimes is a absolute blowout against
destruction. Yeah. And so is Wear Tear, like I said, which,
But Karn, being 4 mana, you can just hardcast him into a Blood Moon sometimes, and then take over the game on a whole other angle because you have a really powerful sideboard and start blowing up opponents' lands, or find a worm coil engine, or maybe you can sequence your Karn and then play a Dryad to turn on your rainbow lands, and then find an engineered explosive to deal with the problematic permanents. So I think Karn is a little bit more of a win condition that can also occasionally help you wiggle out of really sticky situations where you might otherwise just be totally dead because your opponent's found a way to disrupt your mana engine.
Yeah. Both viable paths, I think, right now for this particular deck, and it really depends on what you think you're going to see.
I mean, like I said, the jury's out. I think the interesting thing about Colossus right now is that we're not really in a Blood Moon metagame. They're there, but it's not like all the top decks are playing it.
I mean, I'm certainly somebody who likes to play Blood Moon right now. And I feel like if I'm into it, it's getting pretty big because I'm a follower.
Sure, but I don't know. Like if you look at the top decks being things like Hammer and Omnath piles and Hardened Scales, like if the best and most popular deck in the format was Murktide, I might be more interested in Karn. But the fact that we have a very greedy format right now with so many people at the top of the meta being vulnerable to Blood Moon and still thriving, including Hammer, I think that's why Colossus being a very explosive threat actually, in my mind, is a little bit more enticing.
Yeah. I just like it because it's sweet.
Yeah, it's big and green.
And playing with Karn is always like, okay, what sideboard card am I supposed to get here? Is this the one where I get Sky Sovereign or whatever that, I know that that's not in modern Karn, but it just reminds me of historic, get the boat that shocks something. You're like, The
boat that shocks something.
All right, so let's talk a little bit, because we're running out of time here. Should we talk a little bit about like maybe some quick hit things that we learned to always keep in mind when you're playing this deck? Because I have one that I would love to throw out right away, and we've talked about it a little bit. The hardest thing about this deck is managing, outside of Keep Mull, I think it's managing triggers technically on Magic Online. And I think the number one thing you should always do on Magic Online is put the bounce triggers on the stack first so they resolve last. Now, what do I mean by that?
First one in, last one out.
Right. So when you get this huge stack of triggers on Magic Online, for now, when you're starting out with this deck, I would go and immediately take the bounce triggers and click those first so that they go to the stack. That is so that you make sure that you don't have a couple of different things happen. There's two bad things that can happen if you misplace your bounce triggers here, just off the top of my head. One is, and this is really easy to do when you first start out, is you bounce your land that you want to have untap with Amulet. And so what happens is you don't get anything out of it, because a lot of times you want to have that bounce land returned to your hand because you want to replay it again with Azusa or with Dryad. If you misalign your triggers, what happens is it will return to your hand before it untaps, so you get no mana out of it.
Yeah, just have the Amulet trigger on top.
Make sure that Amulet trigger is on top. Now, the other thing that happens sometimes with bounce lands later in the game is, Stan, do you know what I'm about to say?
Yes, but I'm going to let you say it.
Valakut checks on resolution the number of mountains that you have in play.
Are you referring to what happened to me at the store championship?
I don't know if that happened to you at the store championship, but this happened to me in a league last night. This happened to you at the store championship?
Yeah, so I'll just describe exactly what happened to me and how I basically didn't lose on the spot, where opponent had the literal kill on the stack with Dryad on the board and multiple Valakut triggers on the stack. If you blow up the Dryad in response, the Valakut triggers fizzle.
Yeah. And also what also happens is, and Aaron, Dive Down Nation member Aaron in the Twitch chat right now is pointing out that it checks twice. Yes, it checks once to put the trigger onto the stack. It checks a second time to actually deal the damage to the trigger resolving.
It's because of a comma.
Yes.
The way the card is templated, because they put a comma in a certain spot in the sentence.
But at any rate, what it's really easy to do, if you get really excited when you're Valakutting someone and you're like, I got Valakut online, I'm going to play a bunch about, which happened to me the other day in a game, and I go to the Valakut triggers first, click those and target those at who I want those to be. They go on the stack first. Then I have the bounce triggers. The lands bounce, and then Valakut triggers check to see how many mountains you have left. You have less than 5. The the triggers don't deal any damage anymore. And I did this twice before I realized what was going on Magic Online, that I was just totally screwing up my triggers. But this is another reason to just put the bounce triggers on first, and also make sure you know how to play Valakut. But it's big, and it's a mistake that you can really easily make. All right, who else has one?
Shane, what did you learn?
Playing this deck?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
What did you learn about
Like
yourself?
a quick wait. Before we do this, there's other like timing, like single sentence things I think that can help people. Before we get into Shane going, I hate this deck, which is not the question right now. Did you have like a single like tips and tricks section that you could heuristics?
Man, I don't have like a easy tips and tricks, because I feel like I messed up a lot. Like I messed up a lot. Like there were packs I couldn't pay for because I was off by 1 mana. Like I was like, oh, I could Summoner's Pact and then get this, and I could get enough mana. This was like, oh no, I can't even cast the thing I thought. So I'm not the person to look to, I think, for quick tips. I definitely have a lot of questions.
Well, one quick tip is measure twice, cut once with this deck, kind of, right? Like you need to play almost more so than any other deck. And we say this all the time, like the deck is hard to play because you have to think about it. That's Magic. But you really want to count how much mana you're going to have and what colors the mana is going to be. Because I think this deck can cause a little bit of like long, like when you drive in a car for a long time and you kind of have that 1,000-yard stare, you have the 1,000 mana stare with this deck where you're like, I'm going to make a zillion mana. And then you realize, oh my God, I don't actually, after I have this monster turn, have enough green mana on the board anymore to be able to pay for my pact. That's something that you really should keep in mind. And it happens in lots of different ways in this deck, but you really want to plan ahead in detail what you're going to get on given turns.
This is not a deck that you can learn how to play in a single league. Don't expect to fire up a league and just kind of figure it out. It's, I think, going to be more frustrating than it is enlightening. And this is the only deck where I think that we've talked about in a while, at least, where I think before you even like go into the practice room with it, you want to do solitaire mode with just
pretty much, yeah.
In MTGO, if you're playing this deck online, do solitaire mode first, where you're not playing against anyone, just to figure out what you're doing with those triggers and how to not make some of the easiest and stupidest mistakes, like ending a turn with 8 cards in hand or whatever. Just because playing it technically online with the way Modo forces you to kind of understand every single nuance is the thing that can be really hard at first. That is perhaps a little easier on paper. And then do practice mode so that you can start getting a little, familiar with what you're supposed to be thinking about with your opening hands, and then do a league that you're still going to suck at, but at least you'll know what you should be thinking about and asking yourself. And then watch your replays, because you'll see all the places where you mismanaged your resources or sequenced something poorly. And then maybe, just maybe, on league number 2, you will actually go 3-2 and have a free roll and a burrito.
Mm-hmm. I was so disappointed because you helped me out a little bit when I started to play this. Then we played some practice games. I played some solitaire, and then I was like, all right, I'm going to go play a league. I started League 2-0 and then rattled off like 5 or 6 losses in a row across 2 more leagues, where I was just like, I thought I had it for a couple minutes. Like I was really like, those first couple matches, I was like, okay, I'm seeing how this works. And then I went to bed, I woke up, and the next day it was like I turned back into Cinderella or something. It was like I totally missed it all. It was missing triggers all over the place, and blam. One last weird thing I would just throw out there as an observation that I had some trouble with here and there was, I think you have to be really careful with Boros Garrison, the card. Like, you do not want to accidentally fetch this with prime time. If you're like, let's say you attack with like a non-broken prime time, like you didn't ramp it out, you don't have Amulet or something like that. Don't like randomly grab that card, because it's the only way that you can pay for the activated abilities easily from Sunhome and Slayer's Stronghold. And so later on, if you need that punch again in a second round with a prime time, you're going to want to be able to do that. Now you have Vesuva that can help you go and get red and white. There's just not a lot of red mana in this deck. It's only generated by Boros Garrison and Valakut. And so you have to keep an eye out for, if you want to activate those utility lands, like being careful with when you grab it, I think is important.
Here's another lesson that I picked up, and it's hard to talk about specific lines and sequences, but rather something to just be aware of. Part of the power level of Vesuva is not only that it copies a Valakut or something else that's really good, is that you can change what Vesuva is, and also keep an eye out for the opportunities where you can bounce back Vesuva and bring it back as something really good. And the power level of Vesuva also changes from game to game, where in a burn matchup, Vesuva plus a bounce land plus Radiant Fountain is just basically going to win you every match, because you can like gain 4, 6 or more life in a single turn by copying it over and over, doing that with Radiant, bouncing back Radiant Fountains periodically. But sometimes in the more controlling matchups, Vesuva needs to be a Valakut. Sometimes if you're going for that double Amulet Titan kill, Vesuva needs to be a Boros Garrison. And kind of keeping in mind that your Vesuva can change not just across matches, but even in the individual games, because you're bouncing back your lands, I think is something that will help you win faster and identify ways to actually get out of otherwise tight situations.
Why is this deck so hard? Okay, hold on. You know what? Rather than just kind of dig into the hardness, like, why do you all think that Amulet is sort of seeing a resurgence right now? Because I felt like a dog in a lot of matchups. And, one, I think you're going to feel like a dog when you don't know what the heck you're doing a lot of times. But two, I just sort of also felt like...
Are you saying dogs don't know what they're doing?
I mean, I don't know. There's no rule that says dogs can't play in a Magic tournament, Dave.
That's true. Dogs don't know that they're in movies.
True.
No, but
they think they're just hanging out. That's right.
But like with the resurgence of control, like we saw 25% of the 6 and 3 better meta being like some sort of control variant. I felt really bad against control decks, even oftentimes if I had access to a Cavern of Souls, because they were, bouncing my amulet and then countering it on the way back down, or countering my Dryad, or all kind of the stuff that I need to get set up is being interacted with. So I don't know, did you guys experience that, or is that something where it's just like, my inexperience was showing through? Like I was just like, and then Murktide is really popular. Unholy Heat and Counterspell are just like real messes against this deck. I felt like I was pushing a particularly hard boulder up a steep hill.
Sisyphus, Shaniphus.
Oh, hold on, what? That's me. That's Shane.
Murktide is just a bad matchup. I think Murktide was actually the reason why when we did our episode with the folks from Mishra's Babel, that F Polish is talking about Amulet is unplayable. Also worth noting that the timeline between Amulet being unplayable in Modern and it being really good again was like 2 weeks, because that's how quickly sometimes it can adapt as people understand what lands they should really be playing to solve their problems. I think Punt Then Wine is sometimes really critical in figuring out what that configuration is.
Mm-hmm.
I think... Shane, you started with a question, which is what has led to Amulet's resurgence. I think Amulet fans don't go away because it's such a complicated deck and requires such a time and mental investment to kind of learn and get good at. Whenever Amulet is good, you're going to have a very invested, bought-in community of players jump at the opportunity to play it again, as opposed to something like Burn that like almost anyone can play and pick up and do reasonably well with whenever it's playable. I think Amulet, you just have this loyal following that is eager to play it whenever they can, because they're not scratching the Amulet Titan itch with any other deck.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, I guess I feel like that there's those people that love Dredge and people that love Merfolk, or like love any number of decks, right? But we don't see them showing up in metas that might be particularly hostile to them. They just don't show up because they're not great decks, right? So I am interested in how Amulet's able to keep fighting through and do what it's doing in a metagame that might have some kind of hostility against it. So I think it goes to show the power of the deck and the lines that people can discover with it. But at the same time, I mean, it sounds like you're almost saying like people are going to play it whether it's amazing or not, and then maybe some people just sort of sift through the filter of Modern.
I'm saying people will play it even when it's not amazing to figure out how they're supposed to put it together to actually just be at the top again. And
yeah,
I think part of that speaks to the power level of the individual pieces, because Dryad is so good at what it enables this deck to do, because Primeval Titan is just the best 6-drop in the format. maybe in all of Magic.
Weird. It brings 4 cards into play with it. Did you know that?
I noticed. Isn't it just kind of amazing that the thing that this deck needed to kind of come back was people recognizing how many Cavern of Souls they needed to run? That seemed to be like all that changed is, let's just play more Caverns, and suddenly we're back in the game, and all we're really worried about, at least in the Murktide battle, is Unholy Heat. And then you can start thinking about when are we playing Bojuka Bogs, main or side.
Yeah. I mean, you still don't want to lose your amulets, and there's a lot of ways to kill a turn 1 amulet right now. But then you get to get around counter magic, at least with Urza Saga. So there is that balance there. I just think that the deck got enough of an upgrade from Modern Horizons 2 in the form of Urza Saga that it was able to keep up, as you said. And so Urza Saga was important. Playing Cavernous Souls was important. When Urza Saga first came out, there was a little bit of time where people were still not putting it in this deck. And then, now they are. And I don't know about you, but I basically never made constructs with this deck. I just ran it out there to get amulets, and that's it.
Exactly.
So theoretically, there's a grind plan in here that you can do where you can make a couple of constructs and attack in, but I don't think that comes up that often. I do agree with you, Stan, that I think this deck will continue to be around because people want it to be around and people are invested in making it good and they're practiced at it. And they're way more practiced at it than we are. And, I still managed to feel pretty powerful in a couple of games here and there where I was like, wow, this deck is amazing. And then at other times I was like, that game wasn't good. And I think it was my fault and not the deck's fault.
I almost feel like that cult following is why this is going to be a safe deck to own as a casual spike, long-term barring bans.
That's the problem.
You know what I mean?
Though.
Like
the barring bans.
As long as Primeval Titan is legal, I think there's always going to be people that are very good at Titan and by virtue of that, pretty good at Modern, who are going to find ways to make it work and are testing new innovations basically as soon as they come out.
Yeah. So coming to the end of it, would you play this deck again? We did it for science. We played it because we hate, multiple times we've all said that Primeval Titan is one of our least favorite cards in Modern. Would you play this deck again just for fun without it being an assignment or as a meta choice because you wanted to win?
Stan, you trying your sprinklers?
What's that noise? Shane's a hard no.
Okay. Hold on. I'm going to answer. I'm going to answer for Shane. Shane is a hard no right now. This time next year, he's going to own it in paper, and he's going to be a Titan master.
I don't think so. This isn't the puzzle I like solving. These aren't the. I had no fun. I really had no fun, and I'm not trying to yuck anyone's yum here. I mean, it's just not for me. And yeah, I think that's okay. I think it's fine. I mean, it's kind of thing even if I felt like it was clicking for me and I knew what I was doing, it's just I don't care about solving this puzzle. I don't. I mean, it's just it's not the kind of stuff. I don't like counting mana in this fashion. I don't like being okay, this is 2 + 2 and this is going to be 1. And it's just no, I don't really care.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think it is a very cool deck. I think it's cool to have a completely novel axis of deck building and playing that I don't think anything else in the format does. So that's cool.
Dave, you had fun with it though, right?
I did kind of have
once
fun
it clicked,
with it.
Especially.
I'm a little worried that this is a live long enough to see yourself become the villain kind of situation for me. Well, I have a cart open at Card Kingdom right now with everything I need for the deck in it.
Dave, you're kidding me. Really?
I don't know. I'm thinking about it.
So what clicked with you so much?
I just thought it was different than other decks that I have and powerful. And like Stan said, it's been a staple for so long, but I do get worried that this deck is going to get banned someday. I really do.
Is it just dead if Primetime doesn't exist? If Amulet and Dryad and Karn and literally everything but Primeval Titan are banned? I'm sorry, if everything but Primeval Titan is legal, do you think that the Amulet tool and the surrounding tools within the deck aren't powerful enough to enable something good?
No.
I'm going to say yes. I'm going to say that there's something else that someone would make out of the core that would make a tier 3 deck.
Whoa.
Tier 3. I said a tier 3 deck though. I think people would
it would
try.
be what happened to that other combo deck when Mana Monkey got banned.
Adnaz?
Adnaz, yeah. It'll just suffer the same fate as Adnaz, where someone will 5-0 with it and the Discord will get excited, but it won't necessarily be a prevailing threat.
Exactly. Yeah, I could get this deck for free right now because of how much credit I have at Card Kingdom.
That's dangerous, Dave.
Yeah, sleep on it, Dave.
Don't go down that dark path.
Oh, I hit the PayPal button too late. No, I'm kidding.
Oh, man. Stan, I feel like you had some fun with this one.
I just think that this deck is really important to understand. And I'll say that I had fun in class. Like I really liked going to class, even if I don't want to be the teacher.
You liked auditing Primeval Titan?
Yeah, and I think it's really important to know how this deck works, to see how it loses, to know how you can beat it. And if someone hands it to me, I think it's valuable to know like just the basics, so I don't make a fool out of myself. I don't think this is the deck that I'm going to play for fun because I'm not an academic, because I don't need to solve this puzzle. But I think this is a deck that makes you a better Magic player if you know what you're doing with it, even if you're not actually playing with it consistently.
I think that's fair. And on that thought, thanks for going through this episode with us, everybody.
It was a journey. I felt like we were like taking a walk through Amulet Titan and just seeing the sights.
Yeah, it was a bit of a tour, less of a strategy guide, but I think it was fun.
Now, on your right, you'll notice the famous Castle Garenbrig. And on your left is the famous
Boros Garrison.
Radiant Fountain.
But that does wrap up this week's show. If you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to our podcast so you get the latest episodes as soon as they come out. And if you use Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and review. If you'd like to submit a question to the podcast, you can tweet us at The Dive Down, all one word. Our DMs are open. You can email thedivedown@gmail.com. You can also leave an audio message that may appear in a future episode of the show over at podinbox.com/thedivedown. If you'd like to support the show, you can join our Patreon over at patreon.com/thedivedown. We've ordered deck boxes. We ordered way too many of them, and it's going to be really easy to get them once they're in our hand, but that's only for patrons. Check that out, patreon.com/thedivedown. Shout out to Mana Traders for sponsoring our show. Sign up for a Mana Traders subscription using promo code TheDiveDown2021, all one word, and get 15% off your first 2 months of renting Magic Online cards. Amulet Titan, a very rentable deck.
Mm-hmm.
Not that expensive, probably because relatively few MH2 cards.
Going up a little bit because of Force of Vigor.
But you can still get it with a gold subscription, which I think is an important litmus test.
Yeah, it was 800 tickets when I rented it this weekend for what it's worth. So.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
As always, special thanks to the bands Nowhere and Spaceblood for letting us use their music. And until next week, get out there and order your triggers!